Okay, I'm here with another video. So, I wrote on Ultimate Buckeye's video, if you pin this comment, I'll make a video where I say sub to Buckeye 1,000 times. So, what I'm gonna do now is say sub to Buckeye, or sub to Buck 1,000 times. So, yeah, let's get right into it. So, I have this clicker here, so every time I click it, it'll go. So, I'm gonna start now. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Bucks, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, subscribe to Buckeye, sub to Buck. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. That's 100. Sub to Buck. Oh wait, every 100 I'm gonna say subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye. Subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye. Sub to Buck, 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 Buck, sub to 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 Ultimate Buckeye, sub to Ultimate Buckeye, sub to Ultimate Buckeye, sub to Ultimate Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. Sub to Buck, 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 so sub to Buck, 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 sub to Ultimate Buckeye, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Puck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Puck. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. Subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye. 200, 1/5 of the way. Sub to Buck, 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 Buck, sub to 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 Buck. Sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, sub to Buck, subscribe to Buck, Subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye. Sub $2, 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 Buck. Subscribe to Buck. Subscribe to Buck. Subscribe to Buckeye. 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 Sub to Buck. 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 300, 1/3 of the way there, or about 1/3 to the way there. Now, he actually did pin my comment. But anyway, let's finish this and I'll show you where he pinned my comment. At least I make ad revenue. No, I'm just kidding. Sub $2, 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 so sub $2, 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 sub $2 2 buck, sub 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 to buck, sub to buck, sub 2 buck, subscribe to Ultimate Buckeye, get up to 100k, sub to buck, sub to buck, sub 2 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 bug. Buck, sub 2 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 buck, subscribe to Buck, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buck, 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 sub 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 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 bucks. We hit 500. Sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 bucks. I did it, but I didn't count it, so sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 bucks. I know. Sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 bucks. I think I counted too much. Sub to buck, 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 sub to buck. I had to make up because I think I counted more. I was replying to DMs. Okay. Sub to buck, 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 sub to buck. Buck, sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, so sub 2 buck, sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck. Sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, sub 2 buck, sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck, sub 2 Buckeye, 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 sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, sub 2 bucks, 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 so sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck, subscribe to 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 Buckeye. Sub 2 bucks, sub 2 bucks, subscribe to buck, get him to 100k, subscribe to buck, 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 subscribe to buck. Subscribe to buck, 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 subscribe to buck. Let's go 700, 300 away. Subscribe to buck, 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 go subscribe to buck, subscribe to buck, subscribe to buck, sub 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 2 bucks, 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 buck, sub to 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 buck. I forgot to count it. Sub to buck, 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 sub 2 bucks, 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 sub buck, sub 2 bucks, 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 sub 2 buck, 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 so sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck, sub 2 buck. Sub 2 buck, 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 subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Buck, sub 2 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 buck, buck, sub 2 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 buck, so 2 buck, sub 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 2 buck. Sub 2 buck, 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 sub 2 buck. Sub 2 buck, 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 subscribe to 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 Buck. Get him to 100K, get him to 100K. Subscribe to Buck, 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 subscribe to Buck. Subscribe to Buck, 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 subscribe to Buck. Subscribe to Buckeye, 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 subscribe to Buckeye. I count way too much. Subscribe to Buckeye, 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 subscribe to Buckeye. Subscribe to Buckeye, subscribe to Ultimate 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 Buckeye, guys. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and show you. Okay, we did it 1,000 times, guys. If you don't believe me, I don't know. I literally did it. No cut. This video, I'm not even gonna edit it just to prove it to you guys. Everyone get Ultimate Buckeye 1,000 subs. Okay. Now I need to show you guys why I did this. Okay. Ultimate Buckeye, right? Okay, we need to look at this, right? Let's go on this new video. I'm not trying to get copyright though, so I'm not trying to get copyright, so. Oh, look, I go down. I gotta zoom this out a bit, guys, but it says, if you pin this, I'll make a vid saying sub to Buck 1,000 times. And guess what? I just did that, guys, as you can see. So that's gonna wrap it up for today's video. I'll do it 10 more times just to end the video. Sub to Buck, 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 sub to Buck. I'm out. Sub to Buck.